Hello, welcome to my next video. Previously I discussed the development of methods for obtaining point pattern ending with approaches for complete sampling. In this video I'll start to describe a study that was conducted in the early 1990s that employed some of the survey techniques we talked about before for collecting point pattern data, in particular using a theodolite with a pole. We use this to examine gopher disturbances in tallgrass prairie system in northern Iowa of the U.S. Here we see a map of Iowa. If you're not familiar with the United States, Iowa is in the middle of the country. To the north of Iowa, in that direction, is Minnesota, where Minneapolis is. Illinois is here. Chicago is way out there. So this is in the central part of the United States. Iowa itself has an interesting geological history. If you take a look here, you can see that there's less terrain in this area, which is where the last glacier occurred. South of that, it wasn't covered, so there's a lot more erosion. This makes a very unique environment in the central part of the state to the north, as it's incredibly flat. This also has led to an explosion of agriculture ever since the settlers arrived from Europe in the mid-1800s. And this has really transformed the landscape, removing much of the natural vegetation, which was tall grass prairie. The study site that I'll be discussing today is up in the northern corner here, in a place called Anderson Prairie. This is a slide showing the entrance to Anderson Prairie with a sign here. The prairie is in the background. This is a rather unique site in Iowa, as it was never plowed. Some of the prairies that still exist had been plowed at one point or another. One thing that's interesting too is that it's very different in one part versus another part of the prairie. In one part it has never been grazed, and in the other part it has to some extent. The nice thing about this place is, since it was never plowed, it's one of the few intact prairies in the state. Only 0.1% of the original prairie still exists. All the rest has been plowed and turned into row crops like corn and soybeans. So again, this site provides an interesting opportunity to study some of the natural conditions that occurred in the past, and gives us a benchmark for understanding how these systems operate. Okay, so the system, these tallgrass prairies are characterized by a really high species diversity. You have lots of really interesting forbs, like you can see here. Also a large number of grasses. It's diverse not only in the number of species there, but if you go during different times of the year, the phenology, which is the timing of events, is quite different for different groups of species. If you go in the spring, you'll see a much different group of flowers and plants that are active than you do midsummer, and in the fall, you get, again, another suite of organisms. So not only is there a spatial diversity here, because there are a lot of changes due to minimal change in topography, say 1/10 of a meter will change the water levels and also the soil structure, and you'll see a different group of plants at really subtle changes in elevational displacement. Another thing that's really key in the system for producing diversity, at least that's what we suspect, is the production of gopher mounds. If you'll recall, we discussed gopher mounds in an earlier video for a study I did when I was a postdoc in California. One reason we got involved in studying in this site in particular was there was also gopher activity, so I could continue exploring some of the ideas that I obtained during that postdoctoral period in California. So gophers are really interesting. You may not know much about them. These are a North American species. They're an organism that is known as a fossorial organism. which means that they live entirely underground. I've never seen one in the field. The only picture we've ever used associated with our research of one was a dead one that was placed in a burrow to make it look like it was there. But my colleague who's worked with these as well has never seen one in the field. So they're very cryptic to study. They're really unique in that in many ways they have extensive underground burrow systems. They're very territorial as well, so you'll have a bunch of burrows associated with one animal, and it makes noises, and this keeps other animals from coming in. Another colleague did a study where they removed the animal from its burrow system, and another animal came in within about 20 minutes. They did the same thing, but put something that thumped the ground inside the burrow, and nobody came in because that's a signal that it's active, and they protect their territory quite well. The burrows are really expensive to build, and so again, if an organism dies, they'll get occupied right away to occupy that site. The thing that interests us is that these disturbances, like the one you can see here, have a big impact on the local vegetation. These animals also eat the roots underneath their mounds, and so that can affect what can grow there as well, because they may preferentially graze. So again, what we were interested in doing was trying to look at what impact gophers might have on the development of the vegetation and maintenance of diversity in the plant community. So let's take a look at what our main goals were in the study that I'll be discussing in this set of videos. So the first one is that we wanted to characterize the pattern of disturbance. This falls directly from the research I talked about in California, where we got interested in characterizing gopher mounds and pattern. This way, in this study, we actually wanted to do a really good job of this both in time and space to really understand what's going on. So one component of this that's important is the spatial component, and that's really relevant to what we're talking about in this set of videos, to look at point pattern analysis as a way of understanding how the pattern of the mounds is within the field and how that relates to the plant community. The other one is the temporal component. This is a bit different in that what we are interested in is seeing how the pattern that's produced during one time period relates to pattern in a subsequent period. This could be really important because it could be that gophers are really active in one area at one point in time, but then they go somewhere completely different. It could be while they're active that they use all the things that they can eat and they run out of resources, so they move somewhere else. Or it could be that they maintain sort of the diversity of vegetation as a food resource, and they disturb the same place over and over again. So this could lead to really different sorts of structures of community depending on how that worked, and we had no idea how mound production changes over time. So this was another goal of our study. The third part, which I'll only talk about a little bit, is to determine how the mound production influences plant community diversity and the spatial distribution of the species. We'll talk about this briefly at the end of this series of lectures to try to link it all together, but we'll focus mostly on the pattern formation because that's the goal of your course and also the goal of these sets of videos. We decided to first conduct a point pattern analysis to characterize the spatial temporal structure of the gopher mound disturbance regime. At this time, very few ecological studies had used point pattern analysis to characterize patterns like these, particularly in examining the temporal relationships. In collecting point pattern data, we decided to obtain detailed mound production records over a weekly time step. We began the study in early spring when gopher activity for the year was just beginning to occur. And then we surveyed an area of 80 by 80 meters. To begin with, what we did is we put in a grid, as I discussed in the last video, with wooden stakes at each 10-meter corner so that in the future we could go back and find newly produced mounds within each 10-meter by 10-meter cell. Using meter tapes rather than survey equipment, and this would speed up the time it took to determine mound coordinates. Allowing the work to be done by one person rather than two was also an advantage. What we did was we collected mound data over a 2-year period, starting when they first were produced in the spring, and we went back and surveyed every week to look at new mounds produced so that we had fine-grained information about the number of mounds produced each week. In most studies previous to this one, the approach would be to analyze the data in the grid as one analysis. We did this, but we wanted to develop a more nuanced understanding of pattern development, so we added 2 other approaches that I'm going to present in the next videos.